Looks like we're steady at about 147 people, David.
That's great. That's great, Admiral. I would expect no less. We'll kick things off in just a moment, folks. Let a few more folks come in. All right, well, good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for joining the LBJ School today for a special tribute to a very special individual, Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. The LBJ School of Public Affairs is home to sought-after experts and cutting-edge scholars who brighten our classrooms and teach critical skills essential to students' future careers. And Admiral Inman is an exemplar of this expertise. Now more than ever, we need leaders and teachers like Admiral Inman in our pursuit of civil, informed, and a just society. And today's event is made possible by the Clements Center for National Security and the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law. I also want to thank special guests Mark Updegrove, Larry Temple, Cynthia Osborne, and Will Inboden, and you'll hear more from these guests in just a little while. And now it is my honor to introduce the University of Texas President Jay Hartzell, who has joined the LBJ School today to help recognize Admiral Inman's contributions to the 40 acres and beyond. President Hartzell, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thanks a lot, David. Thanks for the introduction and all the work that you're doing as interim dean of the LBJ School. And being a dean is hard. I think arguably being an interim dean is even harder. And our guest of honor today knows a thing or two about that, having served in that role twice. It's my honor to introduce Admiral Bobby Inman. I knew the Admiral when I was dean and knew part of his teaching role was to serve not only some LBJ students and law, but also some business students. But I've really enjoyed getting to know him more now as president and able to share his love for breakfast tacos as we catch up and I get to pick his brain about how I can do things and how the university's going. Admiral Inman's service to the nation is throughout a stellar career in the military is matched by very few people in American history. Equally rarefied is his service to his alma mater, the University of Texas at Austin. Bobby Ray Inman was born in Ronesboro, Texas in 1931, a tiny town somewhere between Dallas and Shreveport, and struggling through the Great Depression. Ronesboro wasn't the sort of place where we might expect to find a future four-star admiral. The young Inman didn't exactly look the part. Apparently, I learned this preparing for today. When he graduated high school in 1946, he was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 96 pounds. For that reason, apparently, he offered tutoring services to student athletes, and he, quote, acquired protectors, as he once put it. I think there's a key there to understanding Admiral Inman. We see the sharpness of his mind and his ability to enlist it in the service of defense. In this case, it was his own, and later it was our nation's. You may also notice that in those dates, his age upon graduation, he was only 15 years old. 4 years later, he was graduating from UT Austin. He was 19 years old and now stood 6 feet tall, was a quick riser even in that dimension then. First, he considered business school, which I would have said was a very smart move. But the country was better off. As the Korean War intensified, he enlisted in the Navy. Originally commissioned as an ensign, he rose quickly to assume a number of important roles, most of which were related to intelligence. By the end of his military career, he had risen to the rank of four-star admiral. He had served as director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, director of the National Security Administration, and as deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. In those roles, as with everything he's done, he served with honor and distinction. He gained a reputation for overhauling moribund practices and stolid work cultures. Ethical governance, technical prowess, and openness to change were at the core of his leadership styles. After retirement from the military in 1982, Inman became chairman and CEO of the Microelectronics and Computer Technology Corporation. MCC was a consortium that combined the resources of major US companies to help keep America at the forefront of technological change. Admiral Inman knew that doing so would be the key to future of national defense policy as well as our economy. His first job was to find a site for MCC. 57 cities tried to lure the project, but Austin, with some support from Dallas and San Antonio, won out. Part of the incentive package involved a commitment from UT Austin, to invest heavily in its computer science and electrical engineering departments, a commitment made possible with support from private sector philanthropy in the state of Texas. That arrival of MCC in Austin heralded the beginning of our city's transformation into the vibrant tech scene that we all get to be part of today. The story also finds Admiral Inman where he always is, ahead of the curve, in on the action early, leveraging his intellect in the service of our nation and being an incredible friend of our own mater. Nearly 40 years later, it remains a sort of prototype for UT's mission today. It's this concept of government, business, and academia working together to research and to innovate, to commercialize ideas, and to do so in the service of our nation. That's what our university is all about. Several years later, in 1987, Admiral Inman was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. As if that job wasn't enough, the same year he became an adjunct professor at UT. Since then, we've greatly benefited from his presence here on campus, from his knowledge of national security, business, and technology. He's been an educator, a mentor, a leader, and indeed, as I can personally testify, a sage. In 2001, he was appointed the Lyndon B. Johnson Centennial Chair in National Policy. More recently, he was critical to the founding of UT's Strauss Center for National Security and Law and the Clements Center for National Security. And only a decade or so on, those efforts are bearing fruit as today's event is a testament. Quickly, UT Austin is growing our footprint in areas such as national security, foreign policy, and intelligence. We're also seeing new partnerships emerge, such as our robotics lab, a collaboration with the Army Futures Command. Admiral Inman has championed these developments, helped form the vision for them, and quite simply, we're all in his debt. Finally, Admiral, I want to thank you for infusing our campus with a dual passion for democracy and defense. To quote the words of President Biden, Admiral Inman, quote, believes a nation can have both effective intelligence agencies and civil liberties. Inman's dual belief in democracy and defense is as meaningful and critical today as it has ever been in American history. Here at UT, our official motto is Disciplina Praesidium Civitatis, which translates from Latin as the cultivated mind is the guardian genius of democracy. In everything we do, every idea we have, every innovation we craft, every mind we cultivate, we seek to guard democracy. And I cannot think of a member of our community who more embodies our motto. He is a cultivated mind that has so ably and faithfully guarded democracy. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Bobby Inman.
Thank you, President Hartzell, for an overly generous introduction, and to Dean Springer for helping make this session available, and to Strauss and Clements for co-sponsoring. I'm going to plunge straight into my view of what's going on in the world. Those who've heard me before know that I start with looking at overarching threats, then look at challenges and opportunities, and then do a fast geographic span. And we'll try to do that within the committed 35 minutes. Overarching threat, the number one through my entire adult life, has been nuclear proliferation. Currently, we're worried about the addition of North Korea and Iran to the nuclear power structure. North Korea has an unknown number of weapons, but the likelihood high that they're at least 8 to 10, and that they are in fact configured to be put on missiles and reach long distances. The great concern with North Korea isn't that they'll launch a nuclear war, but since everything has been for sale in that ravaged country, that they might be the first one to sell a nuclear weapon to the highest bidder. Iran, poised to start an advanced nuclear weapons program, entered into an agreement to delay, but not to prohibit nuclear weapons. President Trump withdrew us from that agreement, went to heavier sanctions. President Biden is negotiating putting us back, But in any case, the agreement itself is well along the way toward its exploration. The real challenge here, as we know that Iran has stepped up its enrichment of uranium, what progress are they making, have they made, about the ability to fabricate a warhead that would fit on the ballistic missiles which they continue to test? The remaining threats have been shuffled in their order by events that have descended on us. And at this point, for me, the second overarching one is pandemic epidemics, COVID-19, which has transformed our economy, our society, and much of the rest of the world. It's still ongoing. I've been talking about the fear of pandemics for 15 years. And my question always was, are the World Health Organizations ready to deal with a massive pandemic explosion? We now know the answer was no, they were not ready. In the US, President George W. Bush, after the SARS episode in 2003, had invested in stockpiles, protective equipment, other things. But in the absence of a pandemic reaching the US over the years, his successors stopped funding. And we find ourselves, when COVID-19 arrived on our shores, terribly unprepared. Probably for me, the most worrisome was that we didn't have adequate tests to, right at the outset, be able to assess and limit. And we lost several critical months in that process that have contributed to approaching 600,000 casualties in the US alone. Cyber has moved up the list of threats. And again, almost as in preparation for this event, cyber attack on the pipeline that provides fuel to the East Coast. In this case, not as best we can tell, a nation state attack, rather the growing threat of criminal activities, ransomware. Data I've seen the last couple of days say that there have been more than 2,500 ransomware events in this country in the past year. So the scale of that threat is growing. That from individual hackers remains a challenge, particularly when they operate as gangs like Anonymous. But it's the nation state threat. We watched during the 2016 election the extent of Russian meddling in the election and in related crises, trying to diminish confidence in democracy. They tried again in 2018 with less success. And in 2020, we were anticipating a comparable problem, intense watch for it. They didn't go that route. They didn't see the need. The president had already been saying if he wasn't reelected, the election was rigged. So the attack on confidence in democracy was already underway. But what happened instead was a surge in espionage. Different agencies in Russia going through the commercial side, invading through servers based in the US with the National Security Agency couldn't track, through solar winds, to a massive penetration of US business and of unclassified US government activities. That was paralleled not all that long later by a major Chinese espionage activity. China had paralleled the Russian effort through the years, but they had primarily been focused on commercial, getting intellectual property to help their own businesses grow and help them grow into being the #2 economy in the world. So cyber is with us, and we're a long way from having our hands on how to deal with either the nation state threat or the criminal threats or the hacker gangs. Next on the list, used to be #2, international terrorism. They no longer have a geographic entity like the Islamic State that claimed geography in Syria and Iraq, but they're still active. It's almost like a franchise operation. Islamic State claimed credit this past month for 120 attacks around the world in the process. And we've seen those in Afghanistan. We've seen them in Nigeria. We've seen them up in West Africa, as well as a sustained, pretty substantial presence in both Iraq and Syria. Al-Qaeda is still alive, the ones who executed 9/11. They're particularly active in Yemen. So international terrorism problem isn't gone, but it's scattered into smaller entities, which in some ways are harder to find and fight. And finally, in overarching threats, international narcotics trafficking continues to be a bane. For many years, the rest of the world viewed it as purely a Western Hemisphere problem. US as the consumer and providing the gusher of cash, and the growth and the transshipment occurring in South America and through Mexico into the US. About 10 years ago, almost 15 years ago, the international mafia groups, looking at this incredible flow of cash that was being earned in the US, they didn't want to go fight the cartels, but they concluded there must be other underserved markets. So they began shipping from Colombia across Venezuela, over into Africa, up into Europe. And comparably, out of the poppy fields in Afghanistan, across Iran, up into Russia. The end result is there are a lot of other countries that share our challenge of narcotics and their addiction and their damage to societies and to business. The heart of the problem is we have been unable to dampen the demand. And until the demand can be dampened, this will be a scourge that continues to rage. Turning to challenges, top of the list is climate change, global warming. It's at the top of the list of interest of the new administration. We're going to see and hear a lot about it. It's going to bring a spur. We've now had clearance for the first time for the long disputed wind farm off Nantucket. There are going to be a lot of others in the process as there's a race for alternative means of reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, natural gas. But the reality is it's also going to be very expensive. Transmission lines have to be built. To adequately capture solar and wind, we're going to need major gains in battery technology far beyond what we need simply for electric cars. So a lot of investments going to have to occur to pull that off. Migration. We watched the impact of 8.5 million Syrians being dislodged. Still 2.5 million displaced inside Syria, up in the northwest. 2 million or so in Jordan, 1.5 million in Lebanon, a large number in Turkey. But the damage when Turkey elected to let 1 million of them flow across up into Europe and brought major havoc to the economies and to political stability across much of Europe. And we've watched the continued flow of economic migrants out of Africa up into Southern Europe. And we watched it here in our own hemisphere. We've seen the surge since January the 20th to the highest levels we've seen in a great many years. And with the added phenomenon of families sending unaccompanied children in very large numbers in. So Biden administration is scrambling to try to deal with the surge, but particularly with the different nature of it, given the large number of young teenagers and even younger children that they have to care for and try to carry on. So migration remains a major challenge. And when you look out in Asia, we see the impact out of Myanmar and the coup there. Finally, social media. It's pervasive. It's become the primary means by which most Americans get information about what's going on. What's clear is that it's having dramatic impact on governance, on business, on culture. I don't think we yet begin to understand how deep these changes are and where they're going to go. And we certainly don't have a handle on how to deal with it, particularly as the prime purveyor of fake, false information, which again is proving every day damaging to confidence in our democracy. Finally, the changing nature of Organization for Economic Competition. European Union growing out of the common market, and before that, the coal and steel community was sort of the harbinger of what was going to change. And we saw it as a way to make sure that Europe didn't go back to the tradition of France and Germany fighting one another if their coal and steel base was integrated. And we've seen it grow, the Association of Southeast Asia Nations, Mercosur in South America, NAFTA in US, Mexico, Canada in 53, now revised into something called US, Mexican, Canada Agreement. And the shifting nature, Organization for Trade out in Asia and around the Pacific periphery, not yet settled. The US is not a part of it, to our loss and to those organizations' loss as well. So it will be interesting to see if the Biden administration eventually takes the opportunity to rejoin, which the Japanese continue quietly say, we kept the Trans-Pacific Agreement going and you're welcome to come back whenever you want to be part of it. Let me shift to a fast geographic spin, but beginning with the US, Canada, Mexico agreement. There are a lot of elements that are not settled, and that becomes apparent as you look at the shortage of lumber, not only here in the US for home construction, which has fallen way behind. There's a shortage of labor. There's a shortage of domestic harvesting, but the continued limits on Canadian lumber coming in add to this problem. From the Canadian side, they're looking for help in vaccination availability. Mexico, we're 3.5 years into Mr. Lopez Obrador's administration. It continued to be a flood of surprises along the way. The latest is now a complaint. The new agreement put in some labor requirements US labor had wanted, and they're now filing a complaint that auto parts dealers in Mexico are not living up to the agreement. If you look at the delay, the demand for new cars in this country is near all-time highs, but the production is dramatically down for the absence of chips and for parts. Going south, the demonstrations, the rioting but in Colombia has now reached a stage that we haven't seen in a decade. The military, the police have cracked down hard, so a lot of casualties. So it's endangering the political stability that we've enjoyed in Colombia for the last 15 years. Next door, Venezuela remains a failed state. And I mentioned refugees, migrations earlier. There are large numbers of Venezuelans who are in Colombia, in Brazil, elsewhere, seeking refuge from a desperate administration that's essentially destroyed the Venezuelan economy. As you go south, turmoil right now in Peru and in Ecuador, largely caused by COVID-19, but also by election problems. Chile has seen some unrest on a scale that we've not seen since democracy was restored. Efforts to rewrite the Constitution. Argentina, once again, on the brink of default, delaying new agreements with the IMF et al., simply because they're unwilling to face the tough economic music which would be required to be able to service the debt. And finally, the largest, should be the most prosperous country, Brazil. Not only are they in political disarray, but it's the scale of COVID-19, the inept dealing with it, that says they're a long way from being out from under this dark cloud. Going across the South Atlantic quickly, there's a little good news. President Ramaphosa was successful in the last week in managing to expel the leader of the African National Congress, who had been blocking the prosecution and imprisonment of former President Zuma. So that victory by Ramaphosa says we may see the African National Congress stay together and focus on the economy, which is critical for South Africa's stability. And they still have a large COVID-19 problem as well. I'm not going to spend time roaming through all the other challenges in Africa, other than to note failed states, Somalia, Libya, continue to be a challenge. We've seen revolutions in a number of countries, most recently in the Sudan, that offer the prospect of positive change, but it's not yet here. But plunging into the Middle East, once again, violence between Israelis and the Palestinians is reaching a new high, not seen in 6 or 7 years. It began a couple of months ago over an effort to expel Palestinians from some land in East Jerusalem, where the Netanyahu government wanted to authorize building of more settlements. That expanded into rioting around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third most venerated mosque in the Muslim faith. And then it spread further now to a resumption of hostilities between the Israeli government and Hamas, firing of 130 missiles out of Gaza toward cities in Israel, pretty massive bombing campaign response. We're not to the end of it yet. No ground forces have gone in, but if the rockets continue to be fired and they're not able to stop it with bombing, their Iron Dome anti-missile defense has had some success, but at least 3 Israelis have been killed in the Tel Aviv suburbs. So this one has put on the back burner any settlement in the Israeli-Palestinian long running, and it makes a 2-nation solution look further from being viable. President Abbas had recently canceled elections scheduled to Palestinians 10 years overdue, which might have put him on a positive path. but he thought he was going to lose the election, so he canceled it. And as you look over the rest of the Middle East, you have to focus on where's Saudi Arabia going and where's Iran going. Saudi Arabia is the leader of the Sunni faith, Iran as the leader of the Shia. And it's that deep, centuries-long clash between Sunni and Shia that lie at the heart of the disagreements, the fighting that goes on. Iran continues to use the land bridge across Iraq to continue to sustain their alliances in Syria and particularly in Lebanon, Hezbollah. And they continue by ship to resupply the Houthis in Yemen. My sense is that the Crown Prince, MBS, recognizes that his excursion into Yemen was a vast strategic mistake, but he can't dislodge in the process. There are rumors of some third-party negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia to sort of lower the level of tension, waiting to see how that might play out. In Iraq itself, the combination of residual ISIS elements and the Iranian-backed militia, which are particularly targeted the US. US remains there largely aimed at the ISIS threat. But you've seen the impact just this past week when Lockheed Martin civilians who were in country supporting the F-16s that Iraq has elected that they considered it too unsafe to have there. So wait to see what happens with the 2,500 or so US military who are there and the large embassy in Baghdad. But we are seeing in Afghanistan the beginning of the exit. I'm reminded of watching the end of the Vietnam War when the US withdrew under an agreement in 72, and then North Vietnam successfully militarily took over the South. It took 3 years. Whether it will take the Taliban 3 years to resume power in Afghanistan, we don't know. The only reasonable solution for stability in that part of the world would be for the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, China, Russia, the Stans, India, Pakistan, Iran, they're all members. They're the neighbors. They have direct interest. And if they would step up to help try to maintain security, then maybe we'd be better off. In looking at the rest of South Asia, India, of course, is now the worst hit place by COVID-19. And its impact, the number of deaths are huge. They're still growing. They're nowhere near having it under control. The only positive sign is that it has reduced the conflict, the potential conflict back and forth with Pakistan. So that has gone down to not be a hot problem at this stage of the game. Moving quickly to Europe, we've got elections coming up this fall in Germany, which will produce a successor to Mrs. Merkel, who for the last 16 years has been the most forceful, most practical leader in Europe. It doesn't look likely that there will be a comparable rise out of the German election of a successor who will begin with that kind of stature. So Mr. Macron in France is there to try to inherit the mantle, but he's got his own problems. And as with much of Europe, COVID-19 continues to hover over their economic recovery. They may be just getting past the height of this latest surge. That's a wistful hope on my part. But it leads me, as I'm looking at the clock, to Russia. Mr. Putin will complete his current term in 2024. Not clear what he plans to do at this point, but he's laid the groundwork for changing the Constitution, for continuing for another 2 terms after that, out to 2036. Where would he go to enjoy his great wealth if he didn't stay in power is the big question mark. He continues to have great animosity toward us. He's quick to say that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest calamity of the 20th century. It did away with the Communist Party and its impact, but it's left behind total political control by Putin and his surrounding Siloviki. The only hopeful thing that I've heard is that out in the 7 regional provinces that he put together to help manage that large country, that he's been reaching out to bring some younger people into governance. And if there really is a movement here to begin to bring in a younger generation to help govern, that may offer the prospect of some stability. Don't look for Mr. Navalny and his supporters to have enough power to dislodge Putin. They're more a nuisance for him than they are a threat. Going out to Asia, the Koreas, North Korea could be headed toward another economic famine. That will make even more complex what Kim Jong-un elects to do on the international scene. What does he have that he can earn money to help offset that? Here, China is the potential major influencer, but Russia keeps reaching out to make sure that they have some role in the future of the Korean Peninsula. And South Korea is due again to have an election next year. Not clear at all that President Moon has the popularity to remain in power, so we may see a shift in parties once again there. Obviously, Japan is the big central concern, our most important ally in Asia. Abe had to step down for his health. His deputy, Suga, who took his place, doesn't have solid control, but he's got to have an election by September, early October at the latest. He's lost some local elections in late April, so it's not promising for sustaining the level of stability that we had with Abe, who was the longest serving prime minister since World War II. But there's in the wings, Mr. Kono, if Suga doesn't do well in the election, but the LDP remains power, Kono is a likely successor, and he's much more in the Abe model along the way. And that's critical relationship for us. And as I turn to my final look, and that's at China. Xi Jinping came to power in November of 2012 for Secretary General of the party, Chairman of the Military Commission, and then the following March, President of the Republic. 5 years out, he did not bring along any younger people as potential successors, sending the signal that he intended to stay longer than just 10 years. And shortly after the turn of the clock into 2018, he got rid of the constraints on how long he could serve as president. There were no constraints on how long he could be Secretary General and Chairman of the Military Commission. What we have seen is a major assault on corruption at the highest levels. It's had some positive impacts, but his major thrust is to ensure that the Communist Party controls every element of Chinese society, not only state-owned enterprises and the government, but increasingly intruding back into the private enterprises. Deng Xiaoping had unlocked that entrepreneurial spirit back in 78. It led to the Great Surge, which took China to being the second largest economy. Before he took over, there were about 110 million of the 1.2 billion citizens who were reasonably prosperous. Under what Deng Xiaoping brought, there are now 700 million who enjoy prosperity. But that says there's still close to 600 million who don't. Xi's plan is to try to bring another 100 million of those into prosperity in this current 5-year plan, which is just kicking off. Huge challenge. But what he's focused on is unparalleled maintaining control. Inside China, there are voices arguing for him to take the opportunity while the US and Europe are distracted and use force if necessary to bring Taiwan on board as a province, not as an outlier country. This problem will get far worse if the government in Taiwan decides to declare independence. That would almost certainly propel us into a military conflict. Short of that, I think she's going to have his idea on larger gains. So I'm less concerned about the likelihood of his using military force to try to bring Taiwan to bear. He'll wait to see what happens in the next election, I believe. And if it shifts back toward the conservatives who had established good working relations with China in the 2008, 2016 timeframe, that he might be satisfied with that. Now that's a long running look, but I think I held to my 35 minutes. So Will Inboden, may I turn the dais over to you for getting us through the next short time.
Sure thing, Admiral. That was absolutely fantastic. And for those of you who don't know, I'm Will Inboden. I'm a professor at the LBJ School, honored to be a protege of Admiral Inman, and also the executive director of the Clements Center for National Security and affiliated with the Strauss Center, your co-host for today. So I will be moderating the Q&A, and we've already got a number of great questions in the box, but for those who don't, who want to submit questions, while we won't be able to get all of them, we will do as many as we can, so please put them into the Q&A section, not the chat box. And I just hope everyone can appreciate, not only was that a brilliant tour to Horizon by the Admiral, but he did all of that from memory without notes. So anyway, it was just a very formidable performance. Admiral, our first question comes from one of our students, Jordan Cope, and he wanted, this is something that you mentioned in passing, but can you elaborate a little bit more on what you think the prospects are for the Saudi Arabia-Iran talks?
I think the most we could hope is for some agreement to get out of Yemen in the process. I don't see any agreement that would impact on Syria, the Syrian refugees that are scattered all over the Western world, or that would dampen the instabilities inside Iraq.
All right. Admiral, I need to apologize. I know that you don't like surprises, and unfortunately our Zoom security is not very good. We just had some guy crash in here who claims that he's a former LBJ professor and a US Senator. So anyway, Senator Ben Sasse, it's great to see you. I understand you heard we were doing a tribute to Admiral Inman and you wanted to chime in. So the floor is yours. Great to see you, Senator.
Well, thanks for letting me crash for a couple of minutes. Admiral, I just got to hear pieces of that last answer, and I want to say it's, as usual, meatier than most of the committees I'm in today. So I just wanted to pop in and say thank you for being a heck of a great faculty mentor when you recruited me to the LBJ school 16 and a half years ago right now. I've got dozens of Bobby Inman stories I could tell you all, but I want him to keep the floor, but I'll just offer a tiny one, which is I got to travel with the Admiral one time to some national security meetings, and we were flying from Austin up to Manhattan, and we had seats next to each other on the plane, and I was stumbling through some complicated issue I was trying to explain to him and get his advice on that had come out of the corporate strategy world, but it sounded analogous to a topic he was talking about. And he said, "Well, that's just the conservation of enemies principle." And I said, "I've heard of that, but I don't really know what it means. Can you give me the 3-minute version?" And he said, "Oh, absolutely." So it goes sort of like this. I'm pretty fit for my age. He was talking about himself. And he said, "I'm pretty sure I could kick the butt of any 8-year-old that came at me. But if you sent 20 8-year-olds at me at once, I might be in some trouble. One of them would wrap around my legs and knock me down. And then another one would start biting me. And then somebody would start pummeling me in the head." He said, "The trick to this is if you got to fight 28-year-olds, 20 different 8-year-olds, you want to do them in sequence from the side. You don't want all 20 of them to dogpile you at the same time." And then he immediately translated it back to 3 issues that were happening in the corporate world, 2 investments he was making, and he had 4 historical case studies for the national security space. And it's been my experience over the last 16 years, sir, that pretty much anytime I have a riddle I'm trying to solve, you know how to explain it to me both theoretically and practically. And I'm just grateful to have sat under your tutelage for a long time, today to still get to pick your brain and to know that so many people in the University of Texas community and more broadly benefit from your wisdom and mentorship. So I wish we were in a room and I could lift a glass to you, but thanks for the way you've mentored me over the years.
Senator, we miss you greatly here, but we hugely admire the role you've taken on in the U.S. Senate. And we look for you to help lead us out of this chaos that we're in. We need 2 strong political parties to keep this democracy intact. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to eavesdrop for a little bit before I get pulled back into the skiff. We're doing an AI briefing and Senate Intel shortly, but I'm going to eavesdrop here and get a little bit more of your wisdom. Best wishes to you and to Nancy.
Thank you. My best to the chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And Admiral, as you know, and I hope our audience knows, there's probably 30 or 40 other U.S. senators and members of Congress that would also have loved to crash our party here and share a tribute. So a great testimony to the legacy of mentorship and leadership you lead. So Admiral, our next question comes from Natasha Thomas, and she's got a very bracing way to put it. She says, "Is the future going to be China and anti-China, like 2 blocks of the world, pro and anti-China?" And then she follows up, "Is there any possibility of a compromise or a grand bargain with China, or are we just destined for conflict?"
Well, there is no historical precedent for the 2 largest economies in the world having totally different political systems, totally different cultures, totally different histories. So there's no playbook here to turn to help guide us. When I talked to the Chinese group in 2012, I forecast where we are and told them we're never going to be allies. There's always going to be pressure, even can we be friends? What we have to search for, where can we collaborate? Where we can't collaborate, can we build fences to keep those adversarial things from becoming hostile? So that's where, as I think about Taiwan, our goal is to keep it from becoming hostile. There's not much we can do where the Uyghurs or Hong Kong or Tibet are concerned. So it's finding climate change may be the guiding one for the next year or 2, but we need more than that. We need some first-rate China scholars. Happily, you helped bring one of those here to UT, but there aren't nearly as many as we need around the country to help us think through, because this problem is going to be with us for a long time.
All right. And of course, I think as our audience knows, that great China scholar that Admiral is referring to is Professor Sheena Greitens, who just joined us at the LBJ School in Clements Strauss Center this past year, and we're very fortunate to have her. So, Admiral, our next question comes from a recent LBJ student who you'll remember, Laura Eid. Laura is back working in her native Lebanon now. And her question is, do you see any hope for the future of Lebanon in particular, do you see Hezbollah's influence continuing to increase or to decrease?
The only thing that would fundamentally change situation in Lebanon would be an agreement to merge the military wing of Hamas into the Lebanese army. That's been proposed a couple of times, but Hamas would want to run it if they moved into it. And so the Lebanese senior ranks don't want to give up their comfortable life, so they won't agree to it. Without that agreement, I don't see anything on the political side that's going to solve the problems. I have sadly watched it get steadily worse. Some Lebanese friends with whom I've co-invested over these last 35 years, they are steadily moving their families out if they weren't already out in the process. And it's the corruption is still rife across the political parties. And what France left behind, the president would be Maronite Christian, the prime minister would be Sunni Muslim, the speaker of parliament would be the Shia leader. It's not working. And they need to go to some different mix to get a government that will work.
All right, our next question comes from Dave Scholes, and he's picking up on one of your comments earlier about pandemics being one of the major threat categories. And and this also draws on your intelligence background. And he says, the Canadians had an intelligence organization focused on spotting emerging pandemics, but in recent years shut it down. Do you think that it's important that we, he says, reduce the degree that we depend on nation states and governments to report emerging pandemics? In other words, I think he's asking, should that be more in the hands of the private sector or the WHO, or is this something that that intelligence agencies should be prioritizing as well?
Structurally, the U.S. government focused for many years now that the CDC would be the element of the U.S. government that tracked what was happening with pandemics around the world and set the standards for dealing with it. But they don't have the depth in looking for sources and in questioning the validity of what they're being told that's sort of resident in the intelligence community. So anything that's on my threat list, I believe the intelligence community should be pursuing pretty avidly, simply because the other elements of government are not likely to be questioning what they're getting. What we now know is what flowed out of the World Health Organization, even at the beginning of this crisis, was not only unhelpful, but frequently was just factually wrong. So there clearly needs to be significant more effort, and included by the intelligence community.
And our next question comes from John Butler, and he says, Admiral, what are your thoughts about Ukraine and the Russia standoff? Is there any chance that Russia will retreat from the Crimea? And what are the ramifications of Russian occupations of portions of Georgia as well?
Russia moved substantial forces that they'd had on the border back to camps. They'd finished the exercise, but they still left probably half as many as they'd had earlier out there in the process. And why are they there? Well, turns out the enterprising Ukrainians couldn't dislodge the Donbass rebellion, but they could go over and build a dam on the canal that sent water from the Dniester River to Crimea. And suddenly Crimea is looking at the prospect of a water shortage because of that dam on the canal. So my sense is those troops may well be there less to go get involved in fighting and is to go get rid of that dam and open up the flow of water to Crimea.
All right, Admiral, you're fielding many questions across the globe with aplomb here, so we're going to keep throwing the fastballs at you. So our next one comes from one of our star undergraduates, William Wallach, and you had mentioned the Israel-Palestinian conflict, particularly with in East Jerusalem and Gaza right now. And he asked a follow-up to that, which is, what do you think the Biden administration should be doing as they're trying to manage this crisis?
This is a case for diplomacy, not military intervention, but it's to try to get both sides to lower the level of reaction and response. Now, who can impact on Hamas? The Egyptians. So there should be, and there may already be, a dialogue going on with President al-Sisi to get him to really pressure Hamas to cut back on the violence. But those missiles that are being fired didn't come from Egypt. They came from Iran. And so we're back again to the problem. How do you manage to keep Iran from being the provider of military hardware that's enabling the Houthis in Yemen, that the Hamas can turn and fire into Israel, that the Talib, that we just talked about him earlier, our good Lebanese friends. You see, my age of 90 is showing up that I'm dropping names along the way, but it's the militant faction in Lebanon, which again exists because of Iranian supply. So underneath a lot of this, you need to solve the Iran problem. And maybe with that, you can also get a little more quiet. My worry, frankly, is we're in the middle of an effort to put a new government together in Israel. Netanyahu was unsuccessful. I'm a little worried that the level of response back is to make sure that you can't put together a government and that you go back to an election and that this time, fifth try, Netanyahu might get enough votes. So I don't have any evidence to support that speculation, but I just fear that may be levering in the background on the scale of response to the Palestinian activity.
Well, Admiral, we're with our next question, we're spinning the globe a little bit more away from the Middle East back to East Asia again. And this question comes from Michael Dodd. And it's a follow-up on some of your comments on China, particularly on Chinese government espionage. And he knows that you've been very attentive to those concerns, even here at the university, and making sure that we're staying vigilant. Yes, if you could speak to the future of the United States addressing Chinese government espionage activities directed at U.S. higher education, and how we can kind of strike the balance of engagement but security.
I apologize that I got distracted trying to lower my hand in the process. And would you repeat the first of the question, Will?
Sure. Again, it's from Michael Dodd, and it's concerning Chinese government espionage activities and information operations in the United States, especially on American campuses, and how do we strike the balance of engagement but also vigilance?
Let me split the response in two different directions. The espionage, Chinese espionage, overwhelmingly is aimed at getting information from the private sector that they can use in competition at the international marketplace. And that's not likely to dampen in the so we have to remain alert. Cyber is obviously a key. So much of the espionage is done by cyber rather than human. On the student issue, I think we're somewhat overreacting about the impact on campuses. Clearly, there was an effort to create Confucius agents of influence at a number of academic institutions in the process. Happily, we avoided that here at UT, but I'm not in favor of cutting back on the number of Chinese students. If we find somebody that lies about their background, they came in on a student visa, but they were really part of the PLA, then clearly going after them is fair game. But I would note we had that first huge rush of Chinese students in '79 when Deng Xiaoping opened up. The 200,000 came, many followed. We know much more about what's going on inside China now than we did then because of all those people educated in the US, a number of whom like to continue to dialogue with us. So, and they also, some of them are just brilliant young scientists who help push the frontiers of research along with US scientists. So yes, we need to be concerned about influence operations, about espionage. Well, we need to be careful that we don't cut off access to that flow of talent that can be helpful to us over the long term in our relationship, in finding places where we can collaborate.
Yeah, exactly. And further to that, I mean, any potential conflict or adversarial relationship we have is with the government of China, but not with the people of China. And again, those student and people exchanges are a great way to show that. Admiral, we have time for just one more question here before we shift into the next phase of our program, the tributes. And this comes from LBJ student Michael Keel. And he says, Admiral, as we transition back to in-person life at UT, what advice would you give to the LBJ school and the wider university?
Well, I have great optimism about the future of the University of Texas at Austin. I think we have all the components to move steadily up to be the #1 public university. One of the areas where we can provide additional strength to all the elements we already have is to enhance what we offer across the national security spectrum, to become a pipeline to help provide the bright youngsters who are going to rebuild the Foreign Service, those who are interested in going in the military to be leaders, those who are going to help move us along the intelligence world, make the governments work better at multiple levels. But it's the gains in robotics and cutting edge where chemistry and biology come together with advances in computing, pushing the point to find breakthroughs. I think Austin could eventually be the next great place for new startup companies all across the healthcare space, growing out of research done, microbiology, my favorite of the computer science and the electrical engineering, but particularly now that we have a medical school, get a teaching hospital in place and let those, we saw what happened in Silicon Valley, a lot of that out of Stanford. We saw it as a biotech place in San Diego, the merger of UT San Diego, the working between UC San Diego and Scripps. So the potential is here for us to make this is the place in the middle of the country where government looks for advice, assistance, and where economies boom.
Well, wonderful. And you've done so much, as we've been talking about over the last few decades, to get us to the point where we are already, and poised to realize even more of that. So, well, Admiral, we could go on for the whole rest of the afternoon with more questions that have been pouring in, but I know our time is limited, and we also have a few others of us who have wanted to pay a short tribute to you, do our virtual toast, if you will. And so I have the honor of teeing this off. And so for our viewers, my toast to the Admiral starts off with a story that's one of my more embarrassing moments. So a few years ago, a number of us at UT decided we wanted to put together a dinner to honor Admiral Inman and to raise money to create the Inman Chair in Intelligence, which now supports Steve Slick in our Intelligence Studies project. And so when Bobby Chesney and I approached Admiral Inman and said, who would you like to have as a keynote speaker for this Inman dinner? The Admiral said, well, it'd be nice to have Bob Gates if we could, the esteemed former Secretary of Defense and former CIA director, and really one of our nation's leading national security statesmen. We said, okay, great. Well, that's a bit of a long shot, but we'll give it a try. And then who would be your second choice if we can't get Secretary Gates? And the Admiral said, well, Mike Hayden, perhaps, the former NSA director, also the former CIA director, again, another one of our nation's leading statesmen. We said, okay, well, so we've got our marching orders. Let's see if we can get Secretary Gates and General Hayden. And so I flew off to see Secretary Gates at his home north of Seattle. It was all primed. We had a number of things to discuss, but the main thing was going to be seeing if we could get Secretary Gates to agree to speak at the dinner for Admiral Inman. I was just returning from another business trip, so it was one of those get back late one night into Austin and leave early the next morning for the flight up to Seattle. And even though I travel a lot and I'm usually pretty good at packing, I made a very big mistake, which is when I was leaving in the morning for the Seattle flight, I grabbed the wrong suitcase, and it was a suitcase from my previous trip with all my dirty clothes. And so not until I check into my hotel in Seattle as I'm about to go see Secretary Gates, do I open my suitcase and realize I only have dirty jeans in here. I do not have my suit and tie that I need to as I'm about to go meet Secretary Gates. And this was maybe 45 minutes before the meeting. And so I panic, I do a quick search. The only option I can find is a TJ Maxx that is a few minutes away from Secretary Gates' place. And so I dash into the TJ Maxx and grab the first kind of 1980s vintage clothes off the rack I can get. And it's a pretty hideous outfit, but at least it's not dirty jeans. So anyway, pretty humiliating. So I show up at Secretary Gates' place, and he kind of gives me the once over, and I have to explain why I'm wearing this, kind of ghastly outfit from a 1980s music video. But he knew me enough that he was willing to overlook that. And so we had already prepared for our big ask to Secretary Gates. And we had a donor who was ready to underwrite his speaking honorarium, which I can't say how much, but I can say it's measured in the 6 figures. So this was going to be substantial. And I said, Mr. Secretary, would you be willing to speak at this dinner for Admiral Inman? We've got a private jet lined up for you, and we've got a donor who will underwrite your honorarium. And Secretary Gates said, I'm happy to do it, and I'm going to waive my honorarium. He said, because I owe my career to Admiral Inman. And that was a very powerful moment for us of the great legacy of mentorship that you lead. I should add that we had already put in the request of Mike Hayden as well, who also agreed to waive his honorarium. And so we are honored to have both of them at the dinner. But Admiral, just wrapping up my tribute here, what those 2 vignettes about General Hayden and Secretary Gates reveal, I think to me and many of us have experienced, are 3 things. First, you've got a great eye for talent. You have identified so many rising young professionals, such as a young Bob Gates or a young Mike Hayden and others, and position them for success. Second, you're a phenomenal mentor. It's not just that you pick the right people, it's that you make sure they succeed by investing in them deeply. And a lot of us have felt that as well. And third, you really embody loyalty. This is 40 years after you first met Secretary Gates, and he still feels deeply loyal to you, as do everyone else who've benefited from your mentorship. And they know that you've shown that sort of loyalty in return. So that's, I could go on, but I know we have a number of other people who want to pay tribute to you as well. But I thought our listeners would appreciate those vignettes about some of our nation's greatest leaders and the indebtedness they feel to you. So next up, we have my good friend, the LBJ Foundation Director, former Library Director, Mark Updegrove. So Mark, it is over to you.
Thank you so much, Will. Admiral, good to see you. Bob Inman has heard me say this before, but it really bears repeating. Bobby Ray Inman has succeeded in every major undertaking he has ever attempted. He has succeeded, as President Hartzell mentioned, as a student, a 15-year-old college student at the University of Texas. He succeeded in the military. He succeeded in government. He succeeded as an entrepreneur, as a businessman, and in academia. But more importantly, he succeeded as a husband, as a father, as a grandfather, and as I and so many people on this call can attest, he has succeeded as a friend. His success has come because of his character, his sheer competence, his decency, his honesty, his loyalty, and his sagacity. Albert Einstein, another great mind of our species, once said, "Try not to be a man of success, rather be a man of value." But I want to toast my friend, Bob Inman, a paragon of success and a man of extraordinary value. Bob, here's to you.
Thank you.
I believe Larry Temple is our next speaker. I'll throw the floor to
Bob, I think I am up next. Having had the privilege of knowing you now for almost 4 decades and being around you in many, many settings, I've come to believe that you are a human chameleon. You have the intellect, you have the judgment, you have the insight to fit in and excel in any setting that you find yourself in. You certainly have left, as Mark just recited, an indelible imprint everywhere you've been. You did in the military, you have in government in multiple faceted services. I've had the privilege of seeing you in the business setting, and I never saw a better corporate director than you are. Always prepared, always with the right questions, always with the right comments. And then you have now shown that you also can have that imprint in higher education. LBJ's highest compliment, the highest accolade President Johnson could pay anyone, was to say that they were a can-do man or a can-do woman. If he were here today and looked at your career to date, I think President Johnson would say you're not only a can-do man, you're a has-done-it man and still doing it man. He would be proud of you, and he would be particularly proud of the contribution you've made to the school that bears his name. I will say I'm proud of you, and I'm proud that you're my friend. I don't claim to be good, but I will say, like everybody else that knows you, I think I am a better person because I've known you and I've learned from you. I just say good wishes on continued good health and your continued career. And I toast you. I'll toast you directly when we get together, Bob.
Thank you.
I believe I have the privilege to go next, and I have enjoyed listening to all the toasts over the last several weeks of you, Admiral Inman. I've learned so much in this last 16 years of knowing you, and learned even more. I don't think I've ever been so impressed as I was today, just listening to you walk around the globe and tell us everything that we need to know. Thank you for that. I didn't know you during your careers in national security or in information technology, but I'm not at all surprised to know that you transformed those institutions, because you certainly transformed the LBJ School. I have known you as my dean. You're the person who hired me and the person who got me promoted with tenure. And you've also just been a trusted mentor and a valued colleague. I can't thank you enough for that. Over the toasts that we've heard of the last several weeks, to the number of people who have commented on your remarkable kindness and generosity, and I have certainly witnessed those and experienced those firsthand, and thank you. But I would say, in addition to those qualities, I think for me and for others, you instill in me and others this desire to do our best, to rise to the challenges that are in front of us, to kind of believe in ourselves in a way that we may not without your support. You also have this quality about you, Admiral, that when you speak, we listen and we feel that we have to also act. And I have been fortunate over this last several years to really listen to you and glean from you these kind of leadership secrets that you drop, even unknowingly. I think so many of us do. We hear what you're saying and try to emulate that in different parts of our lives. I have some favorites that you've dropped that you may not remember that you've said, but you talked about how when you go in and take over a new role within an organization, that you make changes fairly quickly. You want to make sure that you're the one living with the consequences of those changes and accountable for making them work. You talked about how when you walk in or you build a strong leadership team, that you'll mix things up after a little bit to make sure that those folks are actually strong leaders and not necessarily just bolstered by those beneath them. You want to find that talent on your team and see how folks can stand out. Also, your check-in system, color-coded. Green, good, red, we need to pay attention to it. And it helps to make it so that all the information is brought to you and you're able to act so quickly. There's been several more, and I've been listening, and I appreciate so much all of that wisdom. And I respect you and have really appreciated the opportunity to experience that leadership and guidance and those secrets that you've left. But it's important that we can never forget that you are actually an expert at getting people to share their secrets with you. And this is a talent that you has likely led to your quick advancement in naval intelligence and national security positions. But my exposure to this craft came shortly after I started here at the LBJ School. When you were the interim dean, you hired 7 new faculty members. And we were all junior and green and young and unwittingly vulnerable. And you invited the 7 of us and our partners to your beautiful home for a welcome dinner with your lovely wife, Nancy. And at the beginning, we all milled around with cocktails and had conversation. And when dinner was served, the 7 of us new faculty were all seated at one table with Nancy at the head. And all of our partners were seated at another table with you at the helm. And I can guarantee you that you could tell me things about my husband that I don't know after that dinner. You certainly had a way of having everyone spill the tea, and we all got to know each other after that night and appreciate it. Admiral, I'm going to miss you. We're all going to miss you. We literally built the new LBJ School around you. Your office is still right where it was when I started. And it's going to feel so much emptier without you walking the halls every day. But my hope and expectation is that you're not going to go far away, that you're going to come back and celebrate with us and continue your generous guidance and support and friendship. So thank you, Admiral. Thank you for all that you've done for this country, for this community, for our school. And I personally want to thank you for all that you've done for me and my family. Cheers.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it back to David Springer.
Thank you, Cynthia. Before I offer a closing toast, some of you have already done this, but if other members of our audience would like to leave a few words of tribute in the chat, we'll collect those for Admiral Inman. Bob, it has been my honor to serve as interim dean of this remarkable school over the past few months. And as a former dean, you know perhaps most closely the opportunities and challenges that are heavy on my mind. President Johnson founded the LBJ School as a place for both thinkers and doers, a place where a blend of practicality, scholarship, and diplomacy matter as much in the classroom as in the real world. And at the LBJ School, we bring public policy dialogue from the classroom and into the real world, yet we also bring the real world into the classroom, and you exemplify that very characteristic of the LBJ School. You are indeed a dedicated teacher, a respected leader, a compassionate friend, and a true mentor to students and policymakers and faculty, myself included. I'm so grateful for the guidance and the friendship that you've offered me during my time at the LBJ School. Anyone lucky enough to experience your mentorship knows that, as Cynthia mentioned, you have a special way of listening and observing and offering this sort of Solomonic measured insight. Your footprint at the school has charted a path forward. You've advanced scholarly activity and contributions in the national security arena and built a pipeline for students who want to enter intelligence and national security fields, many of whom as alums are here with us this afternoon. And it's delightful and heartening to see such a wonderful turnout. You have shaped global policy, and your contributions and your legacy are profound and endless. And I am deeply appreciative of all that you've done for me and for the LBJ School. So on behalf of the entire LBJ School community, I extend to you, Bob, our congratulations, our warmest wishes, and our continued success to you. And before we close out today's event, I'd like to turn it over to you to offer a few words if you'd like.
David, I guess the most honest answer is I'm a little overwhelmed with all of this, a little bit like hearing the eulogies at your funeral while you're still alive. My deep gratitude to Will, to Ben Sasse, to Mark, to Larry, to Cynthia, and to you for the opportunity. I will savor all of this, reflect on it, but I realize how incredibly fortunate I have been over these 71 years since I graduated from UT, in the opportunities that have come along, but most of all, the people that I encounter, the people I worked for, who took an interest in me. You can never pay them back. So the thing you can do is try to, the phrase, pay forward. And that's what I've tried to do in response to so many people who helped open doors for me to offer me opportunities. Now I'm going to embark on this next decade of seeing, can I sort of reconstruct some of all those things that went on and draw some useful lessons out of it to pass on to people. But thank you, David, for arranging this today and this opportunity. I hope the lecture will have made some impact on people thinking about problems in the world, but most of all, deeply grateful for the friendships which have been so evident throughout the comments. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bob. Many thanks again to President Hartzell for opening today's event. And my thanks to you, Will, for serving as today's moderator. And a brief thanks as well to Will, Mark, Larry, and Cynthia for your wonderful, heartfelt toast. And we're so pleased that our surprise guest, Senator Ben Sasse, an alum of the LBJ School, is able to join us today. It has been an honor to convene together in celebration of you, Admiral Inman. This conversation is available on the LBJ School YouTube page. I believe the link has been made available in the chat. So thank you again to today's speakers, our audience for being here, our event partners, and a special thanks again to you, Bob, for all that you've done. Have a good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you.
Thank you.